Verisk's Emerging Issues, your source for vital market intelligence on the evolving risks and opportunities facing insurers and risk managers that can help inform product development and strategic planning. Verisk's Emerging Issues.
Hello and welcome to Verisk's Emerging Issues. My name is Greg Scopoletti and I'm an analyst on the Emerging Issues team. Verisk's Emerging Issues team researches almost 60 emerging risks that are facing P&C insurers, but today we're just talking about one, and that is generative AI. Why generative AI? Well, I think it's safe to say that this is really among the hottest of hot topics in the world of emerging risk in 2024. So every year, our team hosts what we call the Emerging Issues Bracket Challenge, and it's kind of a lighthearted way to take the pulse of the P&C industry and see which emerging risks are top of mind. We pit the risks that we research against each other in a tournament-style matchup. We let individuals submit their brackets. We tabulate the results, and we see how it all shakes out. We concluded this year's challenge in April of 24, and as you can see the results here, no surprise, generative AI was the top pick. So it's kind of a qualitative signal about where people's minds are in the world of emerging risks. This is kind of a basic high-level lens that we like to use when we talk about emerging risk. And I'm showing it here because while this is the usual framework that we often like to use when exploring these emerging risk topics, for the purposes of today's webinar, we're really focusing in on the threats side of the diagram. I think it's fair to say that there's been a lot of attention paid, a lot of enthusiasm around the opportunities of generative AI. And I certainly want to acknowledge that now at the outset. There appears to be a lot of innovative applications for this technology, not just within the P&C insurance industry, although there is plenty there, but really a lot of different industries are enthusiastic about this technology and its innovative potential. And we certainly don't want to soft pedal that. We definitely want to acknowledge that at the outset. But generative AI is a huge topic. We only have 45 minutes or so. So I really wanted to just narrow it down for the purposes of today's conversation and hone in on some of the potential risks we see developing with this technology. And we could think of generative AI risk as falling into 5 overarching buckets. And what we'll do over the next 45 minutes or so is step through each of these in greater detail. The first 3 of these buckets, the flaws, bad actors, and some of the ESG and compliance concerns, these are issues that we see potentially impacting the market today, right now. That 4th bucket, disruption, is also a near-term concern, but is a bit more speculative. And finally, the horizon risks, these are some of the potential concerns we see with this technology a bit more broadly out into the future. So let's start with that first bucket, and this is the flaws of generative AI. Now, if you follow the news around artificial intelligence just generally, you may be getting used to headlines that trumpet AIs surpassing some human capability. And I think chess is a great example here, right? Chess appears to be one of those domains of human ability that has been eclipsed, maybe even permanently eclipsed, by a machine. And there are others. But this isn't always the case. In fact, the more you look at it, the more you see that there is also a subset of AI products that aren't just necessarily inferior to human ability, but they may not always work effectively at all, or at least as advertised. Some researchers have called this the fallacy of AI functionality. And it refers to that disconnect between what our expectations are for artificial intelligence and what it may be able to do, and what it is often capable of doing in the real world. And there is sometimes a disconnect between those two. And I'm bringing this up because this is a potentially important aspect or angle to one of the serious flaws of generative AI, at least as it exists today, and that is hallucinations. Now, hallucinations essentially refers to errors made by a generative AI program. It's a kind of confusing term, I think, because generative AI does not actually work anything at all like a human brain, let alone a human brain having a psychedelic experience. It's a statistical engine, and it is making guesses, and sometimes it makes mistakes. So hallucinations are really just a euphemism for errors. But what's tricky about these errors, these hallucinations, is in part what I just mentioned, that we may be inclined to thinking of artificial intelligence and Gen AI as a superhuman tool. So we may not always be inclined to double check its work. We may take it as a given that it is correct. And in the specific context of something like the output of a chatbot or a generative AI analytical tool, these errors, these hallucinations can often be hard to spot. So for example, in a chatbot, you can have wildly inaccurate information, made up sources, made up events that are packaged into what is otherwise a completely accurate response. Now, there's obviously a lot of technical work being done right now to try to minimize these errors, minimize these hallucinations. But at least for the moment, they appear to be endemic to many, if not most, of the large language models that power generative AI applications in the market today. So, in fact, there's an open source project that measures the hallucination rate, the error rate, of many of the major large language models on the market today. And they give the models a simple task. They give the model a news article from a mainstream website. They ask the model to summarize the key points in that news article without adding any extra facts or information. And that's the result that the model is judged on. The best models right now in this database hallucinate 2.5% of the time, and the rates go up from there. Hallucination rates can go as high as 16% in some of the models. And again, this is for a very straightforward summarization task. As I'm going to discuss in a bit, you could potentially see much higher hallucination rates as the source material gets more complicated or as the queries grow more sophisticated. So we know that the technology as it stands today has the potential to make mistakes. The other thing we know about this technology is that there is, I think it's fair to say, something of a gold rush mentality around it. Many organizations across many industries are rushing to test it, to deploy it, to use generative AI in some fashion. According to one survey that was published at the end of 2023, 67% of enterprises are using generative AI technology in some form, and 18% already have generative AI applications in production, which is fairly remarkable because in a very short period of time, this is a technology that has penetrated a wide number of organizations very quickly. So the formula here is fairly simple. We have this widespread adoption, plus the technology's, at least as it stands today, potential to make errors, summing up to the potential for heightened liability risk across a wide number of industries. So let's step through how this could work in greater detail. Let's take professional services. So there is a lot of interest, I think it's fair to say, in using chatbots, for example, to help expedite paperwork or legal research or the creation of compliance documentation. I mean, why are we interested in this technology at all? It's partly for efficiency, right? Everyone wants to drive greater efficiency in their organization. But the potential for hallucinations, that potential for errors, means that you could put serious but easily overlooked errors into work that you are generating with a Gen AI program or application. And in a professional services context, those mistakes, those errors could have at least the potential for real liability consequences for the organizations responsible for making them. Now, we know that humans make mistakes, of course. I like to think it's part of our charm. But with AI, like I mentioned, there may be a perception or at least an allure that what you are getting is better than human performance, that fallacy of AI functionality, in areas where you might actually not be. And that could reinforce the tendency to not do the work of fact checking the outputs or putting rigorous technical guardrails in place to stop errors before they go out the door. And we do have some real world examples of this happening already. For example, last year there was a media report of a lawyer who submitted a legal filing that he reportedly generated using a Gen AI chatbot. Turned out that filing was filled with hallucinations, including references to cases that didn't exist. Now, that incident generated a fair amount of attention. It not only made headlines in the legal trades, it was also national news, and even the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court weighed in on it. So, a fair amount of visibility into this issue, but that didn't seem to be enough to stop another lawyer this year, almost eight months after that initial incident. Another lawyer faces disciplinary action, reportedly for generating a legal filing that she created using a Gen AI chatbot. That legal filing also had hallucinations in it. Now, those are just some high profile anecdotes, but there is actually more concrete academic research that has looked into this specific problem of generative AI errors in legal work. It was a 2024 study out of Stanford University that found hallucination rates for a wide range of verifiable legal facts could range from between 69% up to 88% in response to specific legal queries. Now, we don't know for sure if these are error rates that repeat themselves across other fields, other industries that have similarly stringent factual requirements. But even if we assume that hallucination rates are about half or even a third of what Stanford researchers had found in the legal profession, it still raises some questions about the technology. Because again, if errors are able to enter into the real world, they at least have the potential to create a liability or a litigation risk for the organizations responsible for making them. And this is a concern that extends beyond services, beyond virtual deliveries, but also at least potentially to manufactured goods as well. We see a variety of generative AI use cases for things like coding, manufacturing applications, drug discovery, new materials discovery. But again, at least the potential for hallucinations, that potential for errors, means that downstream of that, errors could get into products and then create potential liability risk for negligent design or defective products for the organizations responsible for making them. Now, there is a lot riding on generative AI, and certainly if you follow the news around this technology, you'll know that there's billions upon billions of dollars being invested into this, and there's been a lot of work specifically done to tackle hallucinations, to tackle these errors. And this is obviously not the place to place bets on whether or not the problem gets solved in the near term or not. But I do want to underscore the nature of the challenge a bit further, and at least one of the proposed solutions that we often hear a lot about, and that is humans in the loop, right? This is the idea that an organization will use generative AI, but you have a human on hand to fact check things. A bit sort of like how autopilot may work in an airplane. For large parts of a flight, it's the machine doing the flying, but a pilot or one or more pilots are on hand to monitor things and then potentially step in if there is a mistake or if something has gone wrong or they need to take control. Similarly, in a human in the loop scenario, organizations use generative AI, they leverage its efficiency capabilities, but they are on hand to fact check things. And I think in a lot of many well-governed environments and well-governed Gen AI use cases, humans in a loop is obviously a way to contain errors. But of course, insurance is for when things go wrong. So let's think a bit more about how things may go wrong, even with a human in the loop. The first thing to note, again, what is the value proposition of generative AI? In part, it's efficiency. So we know that a human fact checker is less efficient than having a machine do everything, an end-to-end machine process. But organizations may say, well, if I have a fact checker or one human in the loop, that human is still arguably multiple times more efficient now, more productive now, thanks to generative AI doing some of that work. So now we have a human in the loop that's responsible for the outputs of maybe 2 or 3 or maybe 10 or a multiple of that human employees. The other issue that I hinted at earlier is that generative AI is a statistical engine. So it is making a guess at what the most probable word that would follow in a sentence, or maybe the most probable pixel that would follow in an image generator. So sometimes the mistakes that it makes, the hallucinations that it makes, are obvious, glaring errors. For example, in an image generating program, maybe you have a human that has 3 eyes or a tail or horns. But often, I think more often, the mistakes that generative AI may make are very, very subtle ones. One analyst called these errors the most statistically probable way of being wrong. And those types of errors can be very hard to spot because, again, to both humans and machines, they looked correct, they sounded correct, they felt correct. So now we have a human in the loop that doesn't just have to do the work of reviewing 3 or more humans, but they also have to be on guard to spot the subtlest of errors. And again, in industries where the requirements for factual rigor and accuracy are very high, the stakes for missing those errors grows accordingly. So there is going to be a lot of pressure on that human in the loop, at least potentially. Let's move on to that second bucket now and talk about bad actors. And here we're focused on 2 angles. The first is the ways in which generative AI may be used as an offensive cyber weapon by hackers. The second is how generative AI itself appears to be vulnerable to cyber attack. So let's take that first part. And here specifically, we're going to focus in on deepfakes. So deepfakes are either artificial representations of real people or synthetic people, completely fake people, that look, act, and sound real. So it's worth stepping back a minute here and just thinking back to the world before generative AI, and before the world of deepfakes. And let's remember how pervasive and effective phishing and other forms of social engineering were, using what are now relatively crude devices, things like emails, text messages, phone calls. Now we have this added layer of deepfakes to contend with, which look and sound like real people. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, we've seen reported spikes in both phishing attempts and video phishing attempts over the past year that leverage generative AI technology. There was a wild story in January of this year, 2024, of an individual who received a video call from a person who looked and sounded exactly like his company's chief financial officer. It turned out to be a deep fake video call, and it resulted in the theft of $25 million. And deepfakes are also an area where insurers may be victimized as well. According to one report published this month, there's been a 300% increase in the number of AI generated fraudulent images that are being submitted with insurance claims. And this is where a related issue comes in, and it's sometimes called shallow fakes, which is really just a fancy way of saying photo editing or retouching. In other words, you start with a real image, let's say of a car, and you use generative AI to edit it or manipulate it. For instance, you could show damage that doesn't exist, or maybe you exaggerate the amount of damage that actually occurred. Now, we've always had this kind of photo editing capability, but if you're familiar with the world of photo editing and retouching, you know that it could be a laborious or time consuming process. And certainly the more sophisticated edits require more sophisticated photo editing knowledge. But what generative AI has done, at least in this context, just as it has done with deepfakes, is make this process vastly simpler. It's democratized it. So now fraudsters have an even more powerful tool at their disposal to potentially commit different types of fraud or different types of crime. And there are other ways that generative AI can be used for cyber attacks. For example, you may be able to generate malware code using a generative AI chatbot. But I want to switch gears now and talk about the ways that generative AI itself can be vulnerable to cyber attack. But before we do that, it's important to take a quick step back to talk about the kinds of data that might be inside of a generative AI model. And there's two things to quickly highlight here. The first is there might be personally identifiable information in a generative AI model. So the large language models that are used to power generative AI applications are trained on a large amount of data that is typically scraped off of the internet. And in the course of that scraping, it may also scoop up individuals' personal information. In one particularly shocking account last year, a woman reportedly found her private medical photos in a database used to train a popular generative AI model. So PII, personally identifiable information, may be inside generative AI data. The second is fine-tuning data. So I mentioned how many companies are looking to embrace generative AI, to adopt and onboard generative AI, either internally or for customer-facing applications. But in many cases, companies aren't building their own large language model. They aren't building their own generative AI model. They're going out to the handful of technology companies that have built them, and they're bringing their own data to these models in a process called fine tuning. They bring their organization's unique data sets to an existing large language model, give it another round of training so you can get more business specific or industry specific outputs. So, data used for fine tuning may be in a generative AI model. And that is collectively what is going in. But what we are learning is that what goes into a generative AI model may be taken out. And generative AI may not only be used for a cyber attack, it may also be the victim of a cyber attack. And that attack may enable hackers to access and steal the data that the model was trained on. And that possible theft includes not just the information the model was trained on, but also the model's parameters. We can think of the model parameters as sort of the mathematical secret sauce that helps a model arrive at its outputs. And there appears to be two particularly concerning aspects to generative AI's possible vulnerabilities here. And this is according to research that was conducted by the Alan Turing Institute. There appears to be two types of data that are among the most vulnerable to theft and exposure when a generative AI model is breached. The first is the data that is most likely to contain personally identifiable information. And the second is the data that is used for fine tuning. In other words, two of the most sensitive types of information that are in a generative AI model may be among the most vulnerable to theft and exposure when those models are hacked. So what you see on the screen here is just a basic taxonomy of the types of cyber attacks that the Turing researchers noted you can use against a generative AI model. And the thing to note here is not not simply the types of attacks, but that these attacks can be launched against a generative AI model if it's public. So, for example, if you have a Gen AI chatbot on your website, hackers may be able to leverage these techniques to extract information that way. But it doesn't necessarily have to be public. These attacks can be launched against a generative AI model if it's used only internally, if hackers are able to breach your system, potentially access this Gen AI model from behind the firewall. They can leverage these types of attacks and extract that information that way. So, our next bucket, our third bucket, are what we're calling some ESG and compliance risks associated with generative AI. And there is a lot of concern and a lot of discussion here around issues of algorithmic bias and data privacy. Those are not the issues that we're going to be discussing here today. Instead, we're going to focus on a couple of issues that may be a bit further below the radar when it comes to ESG and compliance in Gen AI, but still may warrant discussion. The first is the potential environmental impact of generative AI. Now, if you follow any of the news around blockchain or cryptocurrency, you will likely have heard that that type of computing consumes a lot of energy. According to the International Energy Agency, cryptocurrency mining consumes as much energy in a year as the country of the Netherlands. And there's a growing expectation that artificial intelligence and generative AI collectively are on a similar trajectory. The International Energy Agency, is predicting that AI, which includes generative AI, may consume about as much energy in a year as the country of Ireland. You need power at every stage of a generative AI model's lifecycle. You need power to train the model. You need power to run the finished models, and you need power every time someone prompts that model to run an output. Again, the International Energy Agency found that if you just add Gen AI capabilities to a search engine, you could drive a tenfold increase in the electricity consumption of that search engine. And generative AI and artificial intelligence more broadly may also place a demand on natural resources. Let's take water that is used to cool data centers. So, data centers use fresh water for cooling applications. And according to one report, a single tech firm's data centers last year consumed 5 billion gallons of fresh water in a single year for cooling. According to another study, data center fresh water use rose 20% between the years 2021 and 2022. So, what's significant about those years? Well, we know what happened at the end of 2022, right? A lot of these generative AI applications that we were discussing seemed to burst onto the scene. But in that period of time when that freshwater use soared, a lot of those models were being trained. And here's the thing to underscore: data centers aren't using any old water for cooling. That water has to be free from bacteria and impurities. So data centers are generally pulling the same water that we use to drink, cook, and clean with. Another potential ESG concern with generative AI is the possibility of forced labor in the generative AI supply chain. Now, we know that there have been serious concerns voiced about forced labor in technology supply chains more broadly, but that's usually in the context of the supply chain for physical goods, things like minerals that are used to build electric vehicle batteries or semiconductors. But there are also forced labor concerns for virtual goods and services, in this case, data labeling services. So, to build a generative AI model, or really any AI model, you may need properly labeled data. If you're building an image recognition algorithm, you need to make sure that every image that it sees, and I'm using air quotes here because it's not actually seeing anything, any image that this model sees has, if it's a cat, then it has the proper label cat attached to it so it learns to make the correct association. Now, data labeling has become something of a cottage industry. There are businesses that have sprung up into existence that either provide labels to data sets or they verify the accuracy of existing data labels. And tech firms may outsource the work of this labeling to third parties, and some of that work may get filtered down to very low wage workers internationally in what some advocates have called digital sweatshops. And demand for AI training data has led to reports of exploited child labor in places such as Pakistan, Kenya, and the Philippines. And there are reports of withheld wages for these workers, arbitrarily diminished wages, and other types of labor abuses. Now, this may obviously be a moral and ethical concern. A bit more provincially, it may also be a liability concern. So, in the US, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act generally enables civil litigation against entities that profit from human trafficking, including forced labor, even if that forced labor is downstream in their supply chains. We have seen civil litigation brought against technology firms for the use of forced labor in the past, specifically with the forced labor allegations in their mineral supply chain. So there is at least precedent for the tech industry to get implicated in this kind of litigation. And finally, we have the issue of AI washing. Now, this isn't strictly a generative AI issue, it's a broader concern with artificial intelligence. And it connects back to that gold rush mentality I mentioned earlier that many organizations, many industries are rushing to not only use artificial intelligence or Gen AI, but talk about their use of AI, to market their use of AI. In fact, according to one analysis published last year, nearly 40% of S&P 500 firms mentioned AI in their annual report. Of course, doesn't necessarily mean they're using it. Some of those references may be just acknowledging its existence in the marketplace. But a lot of companies are trumpeting their use of this technology. And in December of last year, the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission warned against the practice of AI washing, where companies would make untrue or exaggerated statements about their AI capabilities. And we already have at least one securities litigation in the US District Court for the District of New Jersey against a global engineering company and its directors and officers for its AI claims. And since we're on the topic of securities litigation, let's take a bit of a hypothetical here. What if generative AI is a flop? And by a flop, I don't mean that it disappears completely. That seems utterly unrealistic, but a technology that maybe fails to live up to the huge amount of hype that some people think it's been receiving. Again, I think cryptocurrency and blockchain may be a good analogy here. So there are many companies today that are still working on blockchain applications, still a very viable and active technology. And there's still a lot of money within the cryptocurrency market. But we've also seen something of a diminishment of the hype around cryptocurrency and blockchain. The idea that we would all be transacting via cryptocurrency and everything that we would do would be inscribed on a blockchain appears further away in 2024 since the technology's big debut. And what has happened as a result of that? Well, there's been a lot of securities litigation around blockchain and cryptocurrency. So class actions in this space reportedly soared in 2022, and they were growing before the collapse of one of the major cryptocurrency exchanges that initiated another wave of securities litigation. We also know in the past that there have been boom and bust cycles in the world of artificial intelligence already. There's even a name for it. It's called the AI winter, when progress in AI seems to stall out after an initial burst of enthusiasm. So while it may seem hard to imagine now, we should at least be mindful of the fact that we could hit another AI winter with generative AI specifically. And if it does come, it might be followed by a potentially stormy season in securities litigation or other types of litigation implicating management, directors, and officers. So now we're going to move into that fourth bucket, which we are calling disruption. And here we're looking at the potential for generative AI to influence a trend like civil unrest. So in January of this year, there was an interesting story out of New Hampshire. Apparently, right before the presidential primary there, people started to receive a phone call from none other than the President of the United States. And he was telling them not to vote in the primary, which is kind of an odd thing for an elected official to encourage. But of course, it wasn't the president, it was a deepfake. In this case, cloned audio of the president's voice. But it wasn't just a deepfake. It was a high profile confirmation about what some people have been warning about with this technology since its introduction. Namely, that deepfakes wouldn't just be used for phishing or other types of fraud, but that deepfakes would be used to spread more convincing misinformation and disinformation around important civic events like elections. And we know from experience both in the US and overseas that misinformation and disinformation, no matter how it's spread, may lead to outbreaks of real world violence, of real world disruption, real world property damage. The arrival and mass production of generative AI deepfakes is occurring at a very fraught moment for the United States. So at the end of last year, our team, the Emerging Issues team, collaborated on new research with Verisk's Maplecroft business unit. So Maplecroft, among other things, does political risk forecasting, and they have a new strikes, riot, and civil commotion predictive model. And that model suggests that the US faces an elevated risk of civil unrest this year in 2024. In fact, when Maplecroft looked at the 100 most at risk cities across the 10 largest insurance markets globally, 38 US cities made the list. That's the second highest of any country in the world. Now, civil unrest is obviously an extremely complicated subject. It has much broader consequences and implications beyond the scope of our discussion here today. But if we just narrow our focus a bit and look only at the possible insurance implications of civil unrest, we know that those too may be significant. For example, in 2021, we reviewed insurance loss data that was reported into Verisk across both commercial property and business owners' policies in 2020. If you recall, 2020 saw a significant surge in civil unrest in the United States, and I think the data helps highlight its insurance impact. You can see here business owner riot and civil commotion losses really exploded in that year, and it's a similar story in commercial property. So, again, for all its many ills, civil unrest may have a direct impact on insurer losses, and generative AI deepfakes may be helping to inflame or influence tensions that may lead to spikes of unrest in the future. Now we're going to move on to our fifth and final bucket, and we are calling these the horizon risks. So, to the longer term concerns we see with this technology out into the future, if and when it grows more capable and more integrated into the world around us. So, we love to talk about black swans in the world of emerging risk, right? That event that seemingly comes out of nowhere, causes a lot of damage, but an event that at least some of us in the world of emerging risk, we like to think that why weren't we better prepared for this black swan? I mean, that one of the characteristics of the black swan is it's something that maybe we could have predicted, should have predicted, if only we had had our minds open to the possibilities. So, in that spirit, should we be preparing for an AI black swan or an AI catastrophe? What would such a thing even look like? Well, we have an inkling of what it could look like, at least potentially, in the 2010 flash crash of the stock market. So, this was a moment in 2010 where the market lost 9% of its value, $1 trillion, in the span of 36 minutes. There was obviously a complicated chain of events that led up to the flash crash, but it was propelled in part by algorithms responding to a dynamic set of circumstances in a way that spiraled out of control quicker than any human could respond to. In fact, the markets had to be shut down entirely while regulators and other market participants tried to work out what had happened. What the flash crash demonstrated, I think, is that while we can build algorithms that automate transactions at the speed of light, we may not always be able to predict, let alone control, how those algorithms will behave when they make contact with the real world. And the result in that case was $1 trillion of market capital vaporized in 36 minutes, a financial catastrophe, although one we were able to relatively quickly reverse. So, back to our original question, what would an AI catastrophe look like? What could it look like? I think we may be able to extend this example of the flash crash from a virtual financial market to physical systems in the real world. Let's look out in different industries that are looking to automate their technology, their product with AI technology. Areas such as transportation infrastructure or energy infrastructure, industries where the cost of an unexpected flash crash type scenario may not just be tallied in financial losses, but possible physical damage and maybe even human lives lost as well. And since we're on the subject of black swans, let me just highlight two additional concerns briefly, and that is the potential to build what are called artificial general intelligence, or AGI, or even artificial superintelligence, ASI. Now, if you follow the news around AI, you will know that there are several high profile, well capitalized companies that have announced that they are pursuing artificial general intelligence, AGI. And we can think of AGI a bit like this. I mentioned at the beginning that AI has surpassed human capability in chess, but it's still generally the case that AI is really only better than humans in one specific domain. So that same great chess playing AI may not necessarily be better than humans at driving a car or diagnosing diseases when looking at medical images. It's really a single purpose model, even if it is superior to human intelligence. But an artificial general intelligence would be closer to a more human like intelligence, or more flexible intelligence that would demonstrate better than human capability across not just one domain, but multiple domains at once. So, not only chess, but maybe driving a car and maybe diagnosing diseases when looking at medical images. And we can think of an ASI, an artificial superintelligence, as being like version 2.0 or 3.0 of an artificial general intelligence. An ASI system would demonstrate better than human capability across every known domain. I talked at the outset about that enthusiasm around Gen AI, and there's also a lot of enthusiasm around artificial intelligence more broadly. But you know who often doesn't sound very enthusiastic about artificial intelligence? It's some of the people who work in the field of artificial intelligence. So last year, as the buzz around generative AI was in full swing, a number of engineers, scientists, researchers in the field co signed an open letter under the auspices of the Center for AI Safety, an organization that researches AI risk and AI safety. That letter compared the risks of artificial intelligence to a pandemic and a nuclear war. I'll provide another example. There's a research organization that studies questions of AI risk and AI safety called AI Impacts. And for the past several years, this organization polls experts in the field of artificial intelligence. I just want to underscore that again. They're polling experts in the field, not random people on the internet who have opinions about things. So the 2023 survey of these experts asks, among other questions, to assign a probability to the statement that AI, the development of artificial intelligence, would be, quote, extremely bad for humanity in the long run. So the median response to that question last year was 5%. So experts put generally a 5% chance that AI would be, quote, extremely bad for humanity in the long run. About a third of the poll's respondents put the odds a bit higher at 10%, a 10% chance of an extremely bad outcome. But I think it's important here to underscore what was meant by extremely bad. The survey was specific. It provided one specific example of the type of outcome that they are worried about. And I will tell you, and it will be shocking, but it was human extinction. Now, I do appreciate how that sounds, and I am mentioning this not for its shock value, but because I think that there is a point we can make about where we are with artificial intelligence today and where we are with another emerging risk that many individuals in the P&C industry, if not most, are grappling with on an everyday, a daily basis, and that is climate change. So I think it's fair to say that individuals who work in the P&C industry in 2024 are among the last people who need to be told about how disruptive climate change is today and how disruptive and costly it's likely to be in the near future. But climate scientists, climate experts, at least some of them, began sounding that alarm bell decades ago. The NASA climate scientist James Hansen told Congress about global warming in 1988. That's almost 4 decades ago. I think for many people, those warnings may have sounded alarmist. They may have sounded a bit like the warnings we are now starting to hear from at least some corners of the AI research community. Now, I grant this may be the wrong analogy. There are many, many individuals who work in the field of AI who have written that concerns about more powerful AI systems are overblown at best. Some have argued that artificial general intelligence is technically impossible to build, or if it is even possible, it's decades away. Others have argued that worries about these more extreme scenarios are a distraction, perhaps even a cynical distraction from the here and now concerns that we are facing with AI, some of which we have just been discussing earlier today. But I do think, again, in the spirit of keeping at least half of an eye on our black swan, it behooves us to pay attention to the individuals in the AI community, at least those tasked with researching questions around AI risk and AI safety, because it is those individuals, a bit like the climate scientists decades ago, who are beginning to ring the alarm bells about this technology and its potential more serious risks. We'll close here with a quote from Irving John Good. He was among the pioneers of the then nascent field of artificial intelligence, and his ultra intelligent machine that he's referencing here, we can think of that a bit like an artificial super intelligence. And I like this quote personally because I think it is an encouragement for everyone to think creatively when it comes to the potential futures of certainly technological emerging risks. Speaking of thinking creatively about emerging risks, I like to think that we do this for more than just artificial intelligence. In fact, like I mentioned at the outset, we research nearly 60 emerging risks. Much of that information is available publicly through our website. The URL is listed here. We also have a weekly newsletter, which you can subscribe to through the QR code on your screen. Thank you very much for your time. We have a list of resources, including this presentation, will be available on our website at core.verus.com/EI. Thank you.
Verisk's Emerging Issues, your source for vital market intelligence on the evolving risks and opportunities facing insurers and risk managers that can help inform product development and strategic planning. Verisk's Emerging Issues.